In a single drawn-out instant, the boundary between us blurred, drawing us into a space neither of us had anticipated. The night cloaked the house in an eerie, almost spectral stillness. I sat alone in the living room, where the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the groan of the aged floorboards were the only sounds piercing the quiet. It was one of those evenings steeped in silence, where every noise felt amplified, and even the air carried an indescribable weight. My nephew had been staying with me for the week while his parents were away, and the two of us had settled into an easy routine. We shared dinners, chatting about his studies, his aspirations, all the things that make you realize just how quickly time moves. He had always been a well-mannered, reserved young man. But lately, I had noticed fleeting moments when his gaze carried an intensity that left me wondering. Tonight, however, he was even more withdrawn than usual. The last thing he had said before heading upstairs was, "Good night, Auntie. See you in the morning." I remained downstairs, savoring a few moments of solitude. My book lay open on my lap, though my mind drifted far from its pages. Something about the way he had spoken lingered with me, as if there was more he had wanted to express but chose not to. I brushed it off, assuming I was overanalyzing. But then, around midnight, just as I was preparing to go to bed, I heard a faint creak from the staircase. I froze, wondering if he was coming down for a drink or something. But when I glanced toward the stairs, all I saw was darkness. The quiet that followed seemed even heavier, pressing in on me as I stood there, half expecting him to emerge. When he didn't, I shrugged it off, deciding exhaustion was playing tricks on me, and headed to bed, trying to shake the strange unease that clung to me. As I lay in the stillness of my room, my thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. The shadow on the stairs, the weight of his words. I couldn't explain it, but something felt different. Perhaps it was just the odd energy of the night, or maybe it was the realization that for the first time I was seeing him in a new way. It was unsettling how a single glance or a simple phrase could shift everything. The next day unfolded like any other, our routines unchanged. Yet I found myself noticing subtle differences in him. He seemed preoccupied, his laughter quieter, his eyes lingering a second too long. At breakfast, I caught him watching me across the table, a contemplative look in his gaze that sent a shiver through me. "Did you sleep well, Auntie?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes unwavering. "Yes," I answered, forcing a smile. "And you?" He nodded, though the tiredness in his expression suggested otherwise. His smile carried a trace of something bittersweet. I wanted to ask what was on his mind, but hesitated, not wanting to push. Instead, I busied myself clearing the dishes, willing away the flutter in my chest. That evening, we found ourselves in the living room once more. The television played softly in the background, though neither of us was truly watching. My attention was drawn to him, the steady rhythm of his breath, the way he subtly shifted in his seat, as if struggling to find comfort. I felt his gaze on me, warm and weighty, making me both self-conscious and oddly reassured. I turned to face him just as he averted his eyes, a faint flush creeping across his cheeks. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice quieter than I had intended. He hesitated, his eyes dropping to his hands. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, though there was something in his voice that suggested otherwise. "It's just being here with you. It feels different. Nice. I don't really know how to explain it." A warmth spread through my chest, momentarily stealing my words. There was something in what he said, something I felt, but couldn't quite define. He glanced at me, his expression searching as though waiting for a response I didn't know how to give. I managed a small smile, hoping it was enough to ease whatever tension hung between us. Though deep down, I knew it wouldn't be so simple. As the night stretched on, the silence between us thickened, laden with things left unsaid. I could feel his gaze, the subtle way he inched closer, seemingly without realizing it. With every passing second, my heartbeat quickened, an unspoken energy building between us. Finally, he cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "I think I'll head to bed," he murmured. I nodded, watching as he rose, hesitating as if contemplating saying more. He opened his mouth, then closed it, giving me one last lingering look before disappearing up the stairs. I remained where I was, long after he had gone, my thoughts racing. Something hung in the air between us, something I couldn't dismiss no matter how much I tried. I thought back to the quiet moments over the past few days, the subtle shifts, the unspoken words. And as I finally climbed into bed, the memory of his gaze haunted the darkened room. That night, I dreamed of him, not of anything specific, just his presence, the warmth in his eyes, the softness of his voice. It felt as though my mind was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to confront. When I awoke the next morning, a strange mix of calm and confusion settled over me. The day unfolded as before, filled with small, seemingly ordinary moments. Yet every glance we exchanged felt like an unspoken conversation. As the evening arrived once more, I found myself in the living room again, waiting without fully understanding why. This time, he joined me without hesitation, settling beside me as if it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. But there was something between us, a quiet tension that grew heavier with each passing moment. Just when I thought the silence would become unbearable, he shifted slightly, his knee brushing against mine. A shiver ran through me, yet I didn't move away. Instead, I turned toward him, meeting his gaze, the same look that had lingered in my mind for days. In that instant, I knew something had shifted. We were no longer just family. There was something deeper, something undeniable. I had no idea where this path would lead, but the rush of anticipation was impossible to ignore. I hadn't realized how much had changed until I caught myself seeking him, in the quiet moments, waiting for those fleeting glances, those subtle exchanges that now held a significance they hadn't before. Each time I entered a room and saw him there, a quiet thrill coursed through me, leaving me both exhilarated and unsteady. Yet, I couldn't resist it. The days that followed felt like a delicate dance, a careful balancing act around something unspoken, yet undeniably present. We spoke in layered words, shared looks that lingered a heartbeat too long, always moving just a little closer than necessary. It was subtle, nothing anyone else would notice. But to me, it felt like a current of energy buzzing beneath the surface, electrifying the space between us. One evening, after another day filled with unspoken tension, I found him sitting in the backyard, staring up at the darkening sky. I stepped outside, feeling the cool evening air against my skin, and joined him. We sat quietly for a while, listening to the gentle sounds of the night, both of us lost in our own thoughts. After a time, he broke the silence. "It's strange," he said, his voice soft and contemplative. I've been here countless times before, but it feels different now. I turned to him, sensing the tension settling between us once again, a familiar weight we'd carried without ever speaking of it. What do you mean? I asked, though I had a feeling I already understood. He paused, looking down at his hands before meeting my gaze. I'm not sure, he admitted. I just feel different when I'm here with you. It's like I'm seeing everything from a new perspective. There was something raw in his eyes that made my heart race. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand on his arm in an attempt to comfort him. But the moment my fingers brushed his skin, something shifted between us, and that simple touch felt anything but innocent. I quickly pulled my hand back, overwhelmed with guilt and confusion. He looked at me, his eyes dark and searching, and for a brief moment I thought he was going to speak. But instead, he just held my gaze, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and unyielding. I could feel my pulse racing, each passing second adding to the weight of the moment. Finally, I stood up, unable to endure it any longer. I should head inside, I stammered, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, and as I walked back into the house, I felt his eyes on me, following me until I was out of sight. Even after I closed the door behind me, I could still feel the heaviness of that moment pressing down on me. A constant reminder of the lines we were both too afraid to cross. But that wasn't the end. The next day, the tension between us was almost tangible. Every glance, every word, felt loaded with something unsaid. We moved around each other like magnets, drawn together by some invisible force, yet both too scared to let it pull us any closer. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. Late that evening, as I was finishing up some work in the living room, I heard him coming down the stairs. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching me with that same intense look that had become all too familiar. I looked up, my heart racing, as he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Can't sleep?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head and moved to sit on the couch beside me, close enough that I could feel his warmth. "Not really," he replied, his voice low and steady. We sat in silence, the air thick with tension. I could feel his gaze on me, his presence a constant reminder of the unspoken feelings between us. It was as though we were both waiting for something, an excuse to acknowledge what we both felt but couldn't say. "I've missed this," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "Just being here, spending time with you." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "I've missed it too," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. There was a brief silence, and then he reached out his hand, hovering just inches from mine. For a second, I thought he might pull away, let the moment pass. But then his fingers brushed mine, light and tentative, as if testing the waters. My breath caught, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, feeling the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his touch. We sat like that for what felt like forever, neither of us daring to speak, afraid that words might break the fragile connection we'd found. His hand in mine was warm, grounding me in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. My heart raced, my mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts, each more confusing than the last. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder if things could be different?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that neither of us was ready to confront. I looked at him, my heart pounding as I searched for an answer. "Sometimes," I replied, my voice shaky. "But it's complicated." He nodded, a small, sad smile pulling at his lips. "I know," he said softly, "but I can't help wondering." There was something vulnerable in his gaze, something that tugged at my heart, even as I tried to ignore it. I wanted to reach out, to reassure him that everything would be okay. But I knew that would be a lie. Nothing about this was simple, and pretending otherwise would only make things worse. We sat in silence, the weight of his words lingering between us. I wanted to say something, to find the right words to make sense of the chaos in my mind. But before I could speak, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. For a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. The thought sent a thrill through me, a forbidden spark that left me breathless. But just as quickly as it came, the moment passed, and he pulled back, his expression conflicted. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. "I shouldn't have—" "It's okay," I interrupted, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with disappointment. "We don't have to. It doesn't have to mean anything." He looked at me, his gaze searching, as though trying to read something in my expression. "Doesn't it, though?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to deny it, to brush off the feelings that had been building between us, to pretend everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that would be a lie. "Yes," I admitted softly. "Maybe it does." The silence that followed was thick with tension, filled with all the things we couldn't say. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, as I looked at him, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. This was dangerous, and we both knew it. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to look away. We sat there, the room bathed in the soft glow of the lamplight, the unspoken feelings hanging between us like a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. We had crossed a line, even if we hadn't meant to, and nothing would ever be the same. He stood up, breaking the spell that had held us both captive. "I should go to bed," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. I watched as he walked away, his footsteps soft and hesitant. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret, wondering if I'd made a mistake by letting things go this far. But as he disappeared up the stairs, I knew the choice had already been made, and there was no turning back. Now, the night felt heavier after he was gone. The silence louder, more oppressive. I lay awake for hours, replaying every moment in my mind. The memory of his touch, the weight of his gaze, each one a reminder of the forbidden territory we'd ventured into. Even as I told myself it was wrong, that it could never happen again, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if it was only the beginning. The days drifted by in a strange haze, each one filled with an unspoken tension that seemed to grow stronger between us with every passing moment. We moved carefully around each other, as though we were both afraid of something we couldn't name. Yet, I couldn't deny the pull I felt whenever he was near, the way my heart raced at the sound of his footsteps or the warmth of his presence. One night, as the house lay quiet and still, I found myself unable to sleep. Thoughts of him swirled in my mind, refusing to let me rest. I tossed and turned, trying to shake the feeling, but it was hopeless. My mind kept drifting back to the look in his eyes, the way he'd held my gaze, silently asking questions neither of us dared to voice. I got out of bed, wrapping a robe around myself as I quietly walked down the hall. His door was slightly open, with a faint beam of light spilling out into the hallway. My heart raced as I neared, feeling an unusual mix of excitement and anxiety. I paused, my hand hovering over the door, unsure whether to knock or walk away. But before I could decide, I heard his voice, soft and uncertain. "Auntie, is that you?" Caught off guard, I froze, but then managed to answer. My voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I couldn't sleep." After a brief pause, he said, "Come in." I stepped inside, my pulse quickening when I saw him sitting on the edge of his bed, his eyes meeting mine with a softness that took my breath away. The room was dimly lit, casting shadows that seemed to make the tension in the air more pronounced. I closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch making everything feel final. He looked at me, his face unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the silence pressed heavily on us, filling the space with a charged intensity that was almost suffocating. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and uncertain. "It's strange, isn't it? How everything feels different." I nodded, my throat tight as I struggled to find the right words. "Yes, I feel it too." Another pause followed, and then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver through me, leaving me both excited and unsteady. I looked at him, my heart pounding, and saw the same emotions reflected in his eyes. Slowly, he leaned closer, his hand still resting on mine. "I don't know what's happening between us," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about you." The words hung in the air, each one heavy with meaning, and neither of us could deny what we were feeling. My heart raced, my mind a swirl of emotions as I searched his gaze, trying to make sense of what was happening. Part of me wanted to pull away, to end the tension that had been building for so long, but another part of me, the part I could no longer ignore, wanted to close the distance between us. Without thinking, I leaned forward, my eyes drifting to his lips. My pulse raced as he met me halfway, and the kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of crossing a line we could never uncross. But as his hand moved to cup my face, pulling me closer, the hesitation faded, replaced by a rush of emotions that left me breathless. We pulled apart for a moment, both slightly dazed, our breathing uneven as we looked at each other. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the same mix of excitement and fear I felt. But before either of us could speak, he leaned in again, his lips meeting mine, in a kiss that felt deeper, more certain, as if we were finally acknowledging the feelings we'd been holding back for so long. As we embraced, our bodies swayed together, melting into each other's warmth. His arms wrapped around me, holding me tight, and I felt a profound sense of belonging. The tension and unsaid words dissolved, replaced by an undeniable connection. In that fleeting moment, nothing else mattered. Our hearts beat as one, our breaths intertwined, and our souls resonated. We couldn't control the pull between us. It was as though our bodies spoke a language of their own. The world around us faded, leaving only the comforting pressure of his touch and the soothing rhythm of his heartbeat. I felt complete, my emptiness filled by his presence. Time stood still as we surrendered to the moment, our emotions entwined like threads of a tapestry. Our connection was undeniable, a force beyond our control. But as the reality of the situation began to sink in, I pulled back slightly, feeling a rush of conflicting emotions. I looked at him, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. "We shouldn't," I whispered, my heart aching at the thought of pulling away. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor, but he didn't let go. Instead, he held me close, his arms wrapped around me in a way that felt both comforting and terrifying. "I know," he whispered, "but I don't know if I can stop." There was a vulnerability in his voice, a raw honesty that made me feel both exposed and understood. I could feel that same vulnerability in myself, the same yearning that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Despite the uncertainty, despite the fear, I couldn't bring myself to let go. We sat there in silence, wrapped in each other's arms, both lost in our own thoughts. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, a steady rhythm that seemed to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I knew this was dangerous, that we were walking on thin ice, but in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. Eventually, he leaned back, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want to lose this, whatever it is," he said, his voice soft and uncertain. "But I don't want to make things harder for you either." His words tugged at my heart, filling me with a strange sense of sadness and longing. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But the truth was, I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how to navigate the emotions that had taken hold of me, or how to reconcile the feelings I couldn't ignore. All I knew was that, in that moment, I didn't want to let go. I reached out, resting my hand on his cheek, looking into his eyes. "We'll figure it out," I whispered, hoping my words would ease his fears. "Whatever happens, we'll find a way." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips as he leaned into my touch. As we sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. There was a quiet certainty that no matter what happened, we were in this together. For the first time in days, the tension between us seemed to ease, replaced by an unspoken understanding that words couldn't capture. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my heart still racing from the memory of his touch, I knew things would never be the same. But at that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was that we had found each other, and somehow, we would find a way to make this work. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken understanding. We moved around each other with a closeness that hadn't been there before. Something deeper than we could explain. Something beyond mere words. We didn't talk about that night, didn't try to put labels on what had happened, but it lingered between us like a tangible memory. The house felt different now. Every room seemed to hold the trace of those shared moments. Each glance and touch carried a weight that left me breathless. And yet, there was an undercurrent of fear that seemed to creep into even the quietest moments. A reminder that we were walking a line we couldn't cross without losing everything we knew. One evening, after dinner, he lingered in the kitchen as I cleaned up, leaning against the counter, watching me with that quiet, intense gaze of his. I could feel his eyes on me, the warmth wrapping around me like a soft embrace, and I couldn't help the small smile that appeared on my face as I wiped down the counter. "You're in a good mood," he remarked, a teasing glint in his eyes. I shrugged. trying to keep my voice light. Maybe I am. He chuckled, the sound low and comforting, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal, like we were just two people enjoying each other's company. But then he took a step closer, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The atmosphere shifted once more. Before I could speak, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my hand, lingering just a moment longer than they should have. I looked up at him, feeling the weight of his gaze. And in that instant, it was as if the rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of us in that suspended moment. "I don't want this to end," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what it is, but I know I don't want to lose it." His words hung in the air, a quiet confession that left me feeling both elated and uncertain. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same, that this strange connection between us was something I had come to cherish. But there was a part of me, a cautious voice in the back of my mind, that reminded me of the risks, the lines we were dangerously close to crossing. "It doesn't have to end," I replied softly, my heart pounding as I spoke the words I had been holding back. "But we have to be careful." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine, and I could see the understanding in his eyes, the same mix of excitement and caution that I felt. We both knew what we had was fragile, something that could shatter if we weren't careful. But in that moment, I was willing to take the risk. The days turned into weeks, each one filled with quiet moments that seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if time itself was holding its breath. We shared everything in those days: the laughter, the silence, the unspoken words that lingered between us. It was as though we had created our own little world, a place where nothing else mattered, except the feeling we found in each other's presence. But reality has a way of creeping in, no matter how carefully you try to keep it out. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, watching the early light spill into the kitchen, he entered the room. His serious expression immediately put me on edge. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching me with a look that held a hint of sadness. Finally, he took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Auntie,